Okay, so another kind of typology is something that we call a descriptive or morphological typology. That is, it deals with the shape and other features of an artifact, but they're not necessarily stylistic or what we would consider stylistic features. So, an example of this that I think is um, sort of well known to people even outside of archaeology is the oakshot typology of medieval swords. Essentially, the reason why this was developed in the 1960s was kind of a shorthand for scholars. Rather than scholars describing swords that were found and trying to come up with some sort of common terminology, it was much easier to come up with this kind of typology and classification system so that everyone kind of had a shorthand and a standard by which they could use, where they could say, yes, in this, let's say, medieval site, we found, sword type, oakshot type 12 or things like that. And what it's based on is essentially several features of the sword. A cross section, you can see here, so the shape, if you cut the sword in half and you looked at the cross section, what would the shape be? The length of the sword, the fuller, right, or this hollowed out space in the middle, and also the taper, how tapered it is, if there's a gentle taper or an extreme taper. All of these together create these categories that are fairly consistent categories, right? That is, you can put medieval swords into these different types. These types don't correspond exactly to time period. This is why necessarily using them to tell, let's say, the age of the site is not necessarily a good idea. They also overlap in terms of region. So using them for a stylistic typology would not necessarily be a good idea either. You can see some of the cross sections here, right? So you might have sort of two hollowed areas. This is to make the sword lighter, so that you'll have one big thick spine in the middle, right? This would be an example of one of these kinds of swords that you can see here. Okay, typological categories can also vary with new information, right? So you might just describe something, and then once you have more information, those categories might change. For example, these sort of depressions that were found in the Southwest in a culture known as the Hohokam. At first, they didn't know what these were, so they just described these depressions. Later on, they found out that they were used for a ball game similar to the ball game played in Mesoamerica, and so the terminology changed. Another kind of typology deals with time, or a chronological typology. So sometimes artifacts style and artifact shape will vary with time in such a way that they can be used as good chronological markers at archaeological sites. Right? That is, and this works especially well with projectile points in North America. They vary pretty specifically to time. And so, for example, the Clovis point is the point that was used and is common from the Ice Age and the end of the Ice Age in North America. The period after the Ice Age, you can see that the spear points became much shorter, and the shape is very, very different, right? So Folsom points. So projectile points obviously will vary by area in North America, but they also vary by time period. So a lot of experts can look at projectile points and know approximately the age of the site based on the projectile points. So you can see here, these are the kinds of points from about 10,000 years ago, right? A little bit, slightly later, and they change over time. So projectile points are good chronological markers because The features are distinct from one time period to another. In the Middle East, the best kind of chronological marker to use in sites that are a little bit more recent, like 10,000 years ago to the present day, are not lithics or stone tools, but pottery. Pottery styles will vary by time period, and a lot of styles are so distinct in each time period that they're excellent chronological markers. So, for example, here you can see this is what in the northeastern Syria, this is what late early Bronze Age pottery would look like. In the next period, the Middle Bronze Age, right after the early Bronze Age, you can see a very sharp difference in the kind of decoration. All right, another thing that you guys looked at was functional types. So here you can see this is from Zulu pottery in South Africa. Different shapes of different vessels are designed or can be more appropriate for certain features and certain uses than other kinds of vessels. So, for example, jars are well suited to storage. You have a small opening that can be sealed. Bowls with a wide opening are good for serving. Large bowls, like so, you could see kind of, here, are much better for cooking. So something that's large with not quite as large an opening is good for cooking. These are good for serving, right? This you can see is good for storage, transport and storage, serving over here, right? So you can put the pottery into different functional categories. In general, jars are good for storage, bowls are good, small bowls are good for serving, larger bowls are good for cooking, and you could also classify this even more fully by the kind of clay used. So very thick vessels that would have a lot of heat resistance would probably be designed for cooking. Thick jars probably good for storage, and thin bowls are designed to look nice, to be presentable, and they would be good for serving. So sometimes the function of artifacts can be debated. So, for example, most of these kinds of ivory or stone figurines are typically called Venus figurines. They date from the Paleolithic, the Stone Age, but their purpose is something that's still debated. Were they used for religious purposes? Were they used for teaching? Members of the tribe. Many people think that they represent fertility because the female sexual characteristics are exaggerated. They think possibly that it's what's being depicted is a pregnant woman, and that's a symbolic or represents fertility in these cultures. So there's a lot of debate about that, since these figurines date to about 25,000 years ago to about 18,000 years ago, way before writing. We don't know exactly what they were used for. Okay, so the same kinds of artifacts can be, as you saw with the pottery, can be organized using different typologies. For example, these very small stone tools that are found in the Middle East can be called geometric stone tools when they were first being described in the descriptive typology. They really date to one time period. They're good chronological markers for this time period in the Middle East. So they would be Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age microliths, small stone tools. But they were also used for arrowheads, barbs in a wooden shaft that would turn it into a harpoon or an arrowhead, and that would be the functional typology. One last typology that you guys worked on was technological typology. So for pottery, this can be done in many different ways. You could look at wheel-made versus handmade. There are other techniques that are used to fire a vessel as well, to make a ceramic vessel, as we're going to see next week. Temperature is important, the kind of temper that's used inside of the clay, whether it's coiled or molded, was it scraped to make the walls thinner, was it polished on the outside, right? So technological typology can help you determine the level of technology that the society enjoyed at that time. You could also use it to figure out specifics about the technology. Did they have the wheel? Were they able to get to high firing temperatures using a kiln? Things like that. Did this technology spread from one group to another? These are the kinds of large research questions that you could answer using these kinds of typologies, right? So how did things change over time? How did the technology spread? How did the technology come about, right? That is, does it show a process of innovation, or is it more of sort of a much more slower development? So in general, right, typology is an artificial construct that we create in order to make sense of the mass of data that you end up with after an excavation. And they help you then answer different research questions. Style can help you identify maybe different cultural groups, possibly trade. Chronological typologies can help you identify the time period of a site and how change occurred over time. Functional typologies can let you identify different parts of the site, what they might have been used for. Were certain areas specialized for different functions, or did each house have the same functions going on inside of them? Technological typologies allow us to look at manufacture. Is it consistent throughout the site? What was their level of innovation? How does that compare with people living outside of that area? Right. Okay, a last topic I want to cover this week is conservation. Conservation comes along with excavation. After you excavate certain objects, they might need to be conserved. For example, when we think of conservation, a lot of people think of taking broken pieces of a pottery vessel or something else, like a statue, a terracotta statue you can see here, and putting them back together again. That's only part of it. Conservation also deals with materials that might decompose or decay or erode, and trying to preserve those materials. There are master's degrees in archaeological conservation, museum conservation. Conservators work on archaeological sites and also in museums. The Smithsonian has a program. Some universities have, again, master's degrees in this field. It's a combination of sort of archaeology and art and science. You learn what chemicals can be used on what substances, how to preserve different items, and things like that. Again, on the basic level, putting things back together again is not always as easy as you would think. This is a student I took to Turkey trying to put back one of these very large storage vessels. You can see how large this is. And before she started to glue any of these pieces together, she wanted to make sure she had all the pieces and try and figure out how they all fit. Because there's nothing worse than gluing a vessel back together with one missing piece, and then later on, a few minutes later, you find that missing piece, but you already glued it and you can't fit it in there. And you can see that rather than using numbers, it's actually better to use letters on the joints so that you can see how they actually mesh up. Sometimes vessels are restored to be displayed in a museum. And sometimes when the vessel is being restored, not all the pieces are there. And so a conservator typically will fill in the space with plaster and then paint it a color that's similar but not identical to the rest of the vessel, because they want to give viewers in the museum an idea of what the complete vessel looked like, but they don't want to mislead viewers to think that it is an intact vessel with all the pieces there. Right? So it's sort of showing that, yes, this is what it would look like, but no, not all of the pieces were actually recovered. Shipwrecks and waterlogged wood are something that's very, very useful for archaeologists. As we saw before, shipwrecks, for example, in the Great Lakes or in the North Baltic Sea will preserve really well because of temperature and the kind of environment. But once they're taken out of that environment, they will start to decay. Waterlogged wood, when it's absorbing that wood, will expand. When it's brought to the surface and allowed to dry out, the moisture will evaporate, the wood will start to shrink and also decompose and lose a lot of its strength. And so one of the most famous shipwrecks that was recovered, brought up to the surface, and placed in a museum is in Sweden, and it's a warship from the 1600s called the Vasa. Sank in the Baltic, well preserved as you can see, but when they brought this ship up, and they're doing work just like this in Turkey with ships that they're finding there, is that you cannot let the wood dry out or else it will shrink and start to decompose. So actually what you have to do is keep it wet. And as you keep it wet, you then have to use kind of an epoxy substance which will seep into the pores of the wood and start to hold it together, replace the water, replace a lot of the other parts of the wood, stabilize it, and strengthen it. And this takes several years actually to do. The end result is epoxy-filled wood that will stabilize and be preserved. Right? So this is very, very difficult, and it's obviously very expensive. One example of bringing ships up, but having things not go well, is the Alvin Clark. A lot of times people ask me when I tell them I'm working on the shipwreck in Reed's Lake, they ask why don't people bring up the ship from Reed's Lake and restore it? And I always tell them, well, it's well preserved in Reed's Lake right now. It's survived 100 years. Once you bring it up, it requires a lot of money to preserve it, and the money will not be there. It's very hard to get these kinds of funds to do this kind of work. You either need a very large grant from the government, or you need a very generous donor. So in Lake Michigan, near Wisconsin, this ship, the Alvin Clark, was found in really good condition, and it was raised from the bottom of Lake Michigan. You could see the preservation of the artifacts that they removed from the ship. And the people who brought it up thought, well, once it's brought up and people see how great this ship is and how well preserved it is and what a great museum piece this is, then the money will come in to preserve it like people did with the Vasa. Problem is the money never came in. So the ship, as you can see here, I mean, it looks like it's over 100 years old, but it looks like it still could be sailed. But since the money was not there, it sat at the dock. This was kind of near the border of Wisconsin and the UP in Michigan, so not a lot of tourism in that specific part. So they didn't have the funds to do it, and the ship basically rotted away over time. And it was kind of tragic because that once it's gone, it's gone. Things like ivory have to be preserved in a certain way. You have to use glycerin. Sometimes these things are kept kind of in a frozen state so they don't decompose. Textiles are also very challenging. If they're brought up from an environment, the environment that they were buried in might help them preserve, but once they're removed from that environment, things can go wrong. So sometimes with textiles, for example, an Iron Age dress in Europe, lanolin or some other kinds of oils are used to help preserve the fibers. With metals, of course, different kinds of metals would decay at different rates. So bronze is pretty resistant to erosion. Iron and steel, not so much. And so you have to use different techniques in order to preserve these materials. Okay, our next topic is going to be environmental archaeology, right? And that is going to be posted for next week. So next week, we're going to have a lab on Monday and Wednesday on ceramics. We'll have a little bit of some videos about ceramics and ceramic technology, and also some information on environmental archaeology. I'm going to be posting instructions and a short video about the cemetery project so that you get an idea, and you can also get started on that final project.